Sylvia Plath has been immortalized in modern memory for being the original sad girl. It's hard to say that Sylvia Plath was ever not popular following her suicide, but her popularity has definitely risen in subsequent years. Her picture can be found on almost any Pinterest board describing itself as having a sad girl aesthetic, and her poetry and quotes from her novel The Bell Jar could be found plastered on teen girls' Tumblr pages since the website's conception. Plath is referenced in current songs of artists like Lana Del Rey, read by main characters in TV and film from the likes of Kat Strafford in 10 Things I Hate About You, to Rory Gilmore in Gilmore Girls, and even to Lisa Simpson from The Simpsons. Sylvia Plath is remembered today primarily for her battle with mental illness and her untimely death. But how exactly has she been deemed the original sad girl over other female writers such as Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who authored The Yellow Wallpaper, a short story that also deals with female mental illness in a time where treatment was not readily available or, for that matter, accurate. It's concerning to me that just by looking up Sylvia Plath on Pinterest, I can find images such as these. Some saying that the publisher was written by Sylvia Plath or understands Sylvia Plath on a different level than the average person. And even this one, which was very concerning to me when I first saw it, especially because I'm sure that most of us no longer have gas ovens. Another thing that's a bit concerning about Sylvia Plath being regarded as the original sad girl is the fact that her work has been overshadowed by her death, essentially, and in pop culture in general. In a way, it kind of deems her as just another sad woman and doesn't really pay attention to her work as a whole and her contributions to literature. So I wanted to look at how Sylvia Plath branded her pain through the lens of her work, especially in her novel The Bell Jar, and I wanted to figure out why exactly she's been cemented in modern memory in such a way that may be contributing to the erasure of the actual substance of her work. I believe that without Plath's artful use of object in her works, she may not be at the forefront of pop culture like she is today. Many of her pieces, specifically The Bell Jar, which we'll be talking about today, Sylvia Plath uses objects to translate her feelings of emotional anguish to the audience and immerses them in her own feelings. This technique allows the audience to have a multidimensional understanding of Plath's main characters and, by extension, gives the audience a greater insight into Plath herself. Just for some context on who Sylvia Plath is, Sylvia Plath was born October of 1932 in Boston, Massachusetts. The East Coast is where the majority of her work takes place. She died a mere 30 years later in February of 1963 in London. Famously, Plath died at her own hands in the home of her husband and their 2 young children. Her life consisted of a complex relationship with her father, followed by his death when she was only 8 years old. She faced sexual assault in her young adult life and abuse at the hand of her husband. She also dealt with postpartum depression, which inspired many more of her works. Although Plath was an intelligent woman with great literary promise, her life was riddled with hurdles that are foreign to many people and were not common topics of conversation at the time she was experiencing them. Plath found herself institutionalized more than once in her short life and was actually one of the first psychiatric patients to receive the controversial electroshock therapy, which is depicted in many other still popular media. We also see her main character in The Bell Jar going through this treatment as well. The unfortunate events that took place during her college years inspired her sole novel, which was published 1 month before she died in 1963 under the name Victoria Lucas. The Bell Jar proved to be a commercial success, with readers and critics alike praising Plath's unfiltered portrayal of mental illness in a time where the topic was considered taboo, especially in the context of young women. However, some people have boiled Plath's literary success down to her publicized suicide, but her obvious talent can hardly be denied. Plath's ability to immerse readers into the mental state of her main character, Esther Greenwood, is accomplished through following the experience of Esther modeled after Plath's own life, as she tries to balance her clear literary talent and the expectations of society and her mother. Plath employs object to provide deeper insights into her inner workings, a technique that can be seen throughout Plath's reservoir of poetry and short stories. For example, in her poem Mirror, she uses the titular object of a mirror to reflect how she sees her true identity as she ages. In her poem Tulips, Plath uses the flowers to convey her helplessness in a hospital while recovering from surgery. Plath is incredibly artful at using everyday objects to display her complex connection to her mental health and emotions. Of course, in her sole novel, this is no different. The Bell Jar as an object is mentioned in the novel just 3 times, but its impact is indisputable. Without Plath's inclusion of this object, the audience would have a shallow understanding of the tribulations that Esther endures in her mind. Plath uses the bell jar to describe Esther's tumultuous mental state, and this gives the audience a multidimensional understanding of the character, and by extension, gives the audience a greater insight into Plath herself. So just for reference, because I actually did not know what a bell jar was when I first read the book, a bell jar is a glass, bell-shaped jar typically used to put over delicate objects to protect them from outside forces. In the original cover art, actually, Esther is pictured under one of these jars, and the significance of the bell jar in Plath's novel is highlighted by its role as the titular object. Plath often uses the central symbolic object as the title of a work to emphasize the importance of the object, as seen in her pieces Mirror and Tulips. Plath doesn't actually mention this object until 185 pages into the nearly 250-page novel. This delay prompts readers to wonder how an ordinary object such as a jar could impact a story about a young woman struggling with mental health issues with a promising life ahead of her. I find that this is an interesting choice on Plath's part, and I really appreciate it because by choosing not to mention the titular object until chapter 15, Plath creates an ominous nature around the bell jar that resonates with readers. The bell jar becomes an ever-looming figure for the audience, just as it is for Esther. With the addition of the bell jar, Esther gives a name to the thing that has been following her all along. If the title of the bell jar were anything else, Plath's comparison might go over audiences' heads, and the piece's meaning would be lost. I found a few sources that said Plath and her publisher were originally toying with the idea of naming the book Hours. However, I'm not totally sure how this would tie into the whole novel, perhaps maybe just all the hours she spent being sad. This time that the bell jar is mentioned in the novel, Esther has been offered to be moved to a nicer institution than the one that she's currently housed in, and she does seem very grateful and appreciative of this gesture, but she says that the change in scenery wouldn't have made one scrap of difference to me, because wherever I sat, on the deck of a ship, or at a street cafe in Paris or Bangkok, I would be sitting in the same glass bell jar, stewing in my own sour air. This quote has many moving parts, so let's break it down. Firstly, Plath insinuates that the bell jar follows Esther throughout her different excursions as an eminent figure in her life, just as mental health issues can follow one throughout life. The implications of this imagery allows readers to understand how distorted her perception of life is, as we've witnessed throughout the novel's progression. The second important aspect of this quote is the word sour. She says that under the bell jar, she stews in her own sour air. This shows how Esther really feels about herself. Sour, in this case, can remind readers of something that has soured, like milk, something undesirable. The implication that her air is sour is either because she's been under the bell jar for so long, like milk that's been sitting on a counter for days, or because her air was sour initially. This introduces the idea of Esther's self-loathing that we've seen throughout the novel. She sees her air as sour, her air that everyone else is forced to be surrounded by, her air that is inescapable, and this is almost choking the audience in her own self-loathing. Another interesting anecdote about the jar itself is that Esther is trapped under the bell jar, unable to move outside of its bounds. This illustrates the debilitating effect that comes along with depression and other mental health issues that both Plath and Esther deal with throughout their lives. Plath choosing a transparent object suggests that Esther may feel as if those around her are watching her suffer. The glass would still separate them if they tried to help and reach out. Personally, I see the glass as almost taunting Esther. The glass allows her to see the outside world, allows the outside world to see her, but doesn't let her fully experience what it has to offer. There is a physical separation between what Esther feels and what those around her see. Esther's on display for people to see, but not help. Esther might also be seeing her reflection in the jar, so she might be able to see how much she is suffering, but again, she may not be able to reach out for help, going back to the whole idea of the glass taunting her. Glass can also distort what we see on the other side. Like looking through a glass filled with water, one may appear different from what they really are. This detail could explain how situations are distorted against Esther. Of course, this is because of her mental illness. Without the imagery of Esther trapped underneath the bell jar, the audience may not understand Esther's struggles as intensely. As I was writing the script for this video, I realized that the description of the bell jar is almost philosophical. Many philosophers describe universal experiences, but the only difference is they are able to actually put a name to them. They are able to accurately describe what the phenomenon being described is, just as Plath describes what it's like to suffer from mental illness in terms that are accessible to a greater audience. This perhaps contributing to why Plath is still at the forefront of contemporary memory today. For example, philosopher Bishop George Berkeley said, "To be is to be perceived." He described the universal phenomenon that objects only exist when others can perceive them, and one cannot exist without being perceived. We all inherently know this, we are just unable to describe it, unable to put words to it. Similarly, Plath describes a state of being that is nearly impossible to describe and impossible to understand if one has never felt it before, making her revelation that much more impactful. Perhaps it is this revelation that has cemented her place in common memory, making Plath almost the sage of sad girls everywhere. Plath's second mention of the bell jar is near the end of the novel. After Esther's mother urges her to forget her stint in the institution and think of it as just a bad dream, Plath speaks directly to the audience. She sardonically writes, "To the person in the bell jar, blank and stopped as a dead baby, the world itself is a bad dream. A bad dream." If you read the book, you know that the mention of the dead baby in this quote is a callback to earlier in the novel when she saw various states of fetuses in jars at a medical school. This morbid comparison of life ended in such an early state offers further insight into the hopelessness that the bell jar could make one feel, just as we imagine a close to full-term fetus dying within its mother, where we would expect them to feel safe and protected. The idea of being trapped under the bell jar being a bad dream is another interesting inclusion by Plath. Part of Esther agrees that, yes, being trapped in a distorting depression can feel like a bad dream, but for her, this is her whole life. Esther's trapped in her depression like she's trapped in the bell jar. The irony of Plath choosing the analogy of a bad dream is that we can wake from our dreams. If our life is therefore a bad dream, it's implied that we can still wake up even though Esther sees her illness as unescapable. Perhaps Esther sees the only way of truly escaping this bad dream is through ending her own life. This revelation also highlights the hypocrisy that Esther sees in her mother's comments. This kind of reminds me of people who say, well, just be happy when you say that you're feeling down. It's like, oh, wow, I actually didn't think of that. Thank you, that's so helpful. The final mention of the bell jar closely follows the second. Esther wonders if she's really ready to leave the hospital and she's questioning her treatment. She asks, "How did I know that someday, at college, in Europe, somewhere, anywhere, that the bell jar, with its stifling distortions, wouldn't descend again?" I actually quite enjoy this last quote that mentions the bell jar. I think that it's a realistic feeling for Esther. Leaving the hospital will of course not mark the end of her depression, and it would be typical for someone in her situation to be skeptical about their future when they just so recently tried to end it. The bell jar is not something Esther wants to be under again, but it is more than likely to happen. And I do really enjoy the skepticism that comes along with this line. I feel that Sylvia Plath knew that it would be in bad faith to end the novel in a hopeful manner, perhaps saying, "I'm sure the bell jar won't descend again," or, something more artful than that. And of course, this line is bittersweet. Esther is happy to be leaving the hospital and hopefully to go back to her life, but the bell jar continues to be an ever-looming figure just as it was before. But if Esther can escape the bell jar once, she surely can escape it again, right? By using this object to represent Esther's feelings of entrapment, distortion, helplessness, paranoia, self-loathing, and fear, Plath invites the audience into her own mental battles. The inclusion of the bell jar deepens the reader's comprehension of Esther's descent into madness, which allows insight into the intricate layers of her internal battles and the societal pressures that contribute to her depression. Plath artfully situates the bell jar over Esther, then slowly removes Esther from her glass entrapment, all in front of the audience's eyes. Without Plath's inclusion of the symbolic bell jar, the audience would have a shallow understanding of the intense tribulations that Esther endures in her mind, and the battles that Plath herself failed to overcome. Without Plath's ability to describe the anguish of depression through a tangible object, without her philosophical approach to describing depression in a time where its topic was taboo, Plath might cease to be as prominent in pop culture as she is today, and the title of Original Sad Girl may have gone to someone else. As we touched on a bit in the beginning, the title that she's been given kind of demeans her body of work. Plath's complex ideas about life and the demands of womanhood are overshadowed by her place in pop culture, which in a way just deems her as another sad woman, but nonetheless the original. In modern eyes, especially among younger generations, her work deserves to be held in the same light as that of other writers such as George Orwell, John Steinbeck, and Zora Neale Hurston, all of which are included in modern curriculum today, as well as the bell jar. But The bell jar has been over-glorified in such a way that romanticizes mental illness instead of focusing on the literary merit that Plath displays, like how Sylvia Plath chooses to include the bell jar to change audiences' understanding of depression and mental illness as they knew it in the 50s and 60s. The bell jar was undeniably a factor in destigmatizing mental health and encouraging women, or just people in general, to support each other during dark times, as well as catapulting mental health reform. Without Plath, it's uncertain how women today might go about talking about their mental health struggles and how they would be treated by society for their struggles. Overall, Plath's book offers a deeper understanding of mental struggles and offers a common person who may have never had mental struggles to understand what somebody could be going through. Of course, it is the object of the bell jar that successfully gives the audience a greater understanding into the mental torment and tribulation that Plath faces. Without the inclusion of this object, Sylvia Plath may have failed to make her point entirely. That is why it is so important to remember Sylvia Plath's contribution to literature, as well as acknowledging her contribution to overall pop culture, as both are very much so indisputable. However, I do think that we need to be careful when romanticizing Sylvia Plath's work, because this was the work of a woman who did commit suicide. Maybe instead, when we're looking at the quote about the fig tree, we can think about how beautiful and artful the imagery that Sylvia Plath is providing to us, rather than thinking of how tortured she was. It's kind of sad that by modern standards, you need to be some form of tortured in order for your art to mean anything. We have to wonder if Sylvia Plath never committed suicide, if the bell jar would have been as big as it is today. I really do think that we should be focusing on the literary merit of Sylvia Plath and her contribution to literature, how she successfully packaged pain in a palatable way, rather than her place as the original sad girl in the eyes of teen girls everywhere. Thank you so much for watching. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Bye.